Welcome to section 2.10. We're going to cover plant cell structures. So most of the stuff we've talked about before applies to just about all eukaryotic cells. And a couple of them, centrioles, usually lysosomes, usually cilia, apply generally to animal cells. But there are several structures that we'll find specifically in plant cells. We're going to kind of ignore most other cells that are not prokaryotic or plant animal cells. There are protists, there are other things that exist, but we're going to, for right now, kind of just lump some things together and ignore some things to focus on just these three general types. So prokaryotes, and amongst the eukaryotes, plant and animal cells. So within plant cells, the first thing you'll see will be the cell wall. And this is going to be made of cellulose as well as some other proteins, some other polysaccharides. It's going to be a mix, but it has a lot of the guy we talked about before when we talked about carbohydrates, which was cellulose. So you'll find a fair amount of that. We call that fiber when you eat it in your diet. And one of the things about the cell wall is it's rigid, which helps to give the plant cells shape. And their shape will tend to be fairly boxy. It can be like a rectangular, like a column, if you will. But because it's rigid, they don't have like animals do, where they're much more flexible. You can think of it where like an animal cell is like a balloon that's not fully inflated, so you can kind of like squish it and move it. Whereas with a plant cell, it's kind of like you inflated a balloon inside of a wooden or metal box. And so it now has the shape of that box and it's rigid. It's also critical for plants that they have these cell walls because they tend to be pressurized. If you've ever not watered a plant for a while, we'll assume it was unintentional. You don't just hate plants. But if you don't water one for a while, you'll see it starts to wilt, where it starts to kind of droop. You'll see it start to lean to the side. If you have something inflatable, like an inflatable sword, you'll see the same type idea where as the air starts to leave, it starts to collapse to a side. And so with plants, they need to have the cells pressurized, and that's why they need the cell wall. If they didn't have this rigid cell wall, it'd be like a balloon that just kept swelling till it pops, till it blows up. And so animal cells, this can happen to us. If you sit around in a pool or a bathtub for a really long time, you can see like the white dead skin because as water goes in, it actually ruptures that plasma membrane. It's not strong enough to hold it together. And so for plants, because they're almost always pressurized, that's one of the ways they get strength. It's important that they have this rigid outer part, the cell wall, which will be just outside the plasma membrane. So this yellow you could think of as like the plasma membrane, and the green would be the cell wall that's just outside of that. Now prokaryotes and other cells can have a cell wall, but animal cells will not. So keep in mind, it's not that only plants can have a cell wall, but if we're comparing plants and animal cells, only plant cells have it. Now the next thing that we have will be one of the more noticeable things in many plant cells, and that's this gigantic vacuole. And so this gigantic vacuole is called the central vacuole. Now vacuoles aren't a new idea. We've seen these in animals, but they tend to be fairly small. They tend to have fairly specific purposes within animal cells. In plant cells, this is kind of their basement, their attic, their garage. It's the place where they store waste, they store water. We've talked about how they need a lot of water. They can store toxins to try and prevent stuff eating them. They can't just go around and like stab you in the face. So their solution is very passive aggressive, where they'll store toxins. So if you start to munch on them and damage the cells, these toxins leak out. And so that's why ultimately people will say, like, don't just eat random berries in the forest because you don't know if they have toxins in them. Same thing as just munching on leaves. You don't know if they've developed or evolved over the years some type of toxin to try to ward off predators. The tonoplast is just a fancy word for the membrane that surrounds this, because we've said the central vacuole is pretty important in terms of storage. And so this tonoplast is rather important in determining what goes into storage and what comes out of it. And so this tonoplast membrane can be somewhat of a big deal in a plant just because the central vacuole is used for so many purposes. In a large part too because the central vacuole is so stinking big. You're talking 33 to 90% of the total cell is taken up by just this one gigantic vacuole. And so this membrane that kind of determines, much like your plasma membrane, what's going to be stored and what's safe to come out is very important to that plant because it needs to make sure certain things stay sequestered and that it has the right amount of water that's being stuck in there to make sure it's rigid. Some of that it can't help if there's no water to be had, but it wants to make sure it's got all these proper homeostatic functions so it doesn't screw up. So largely still storage. There'll be some metabolic stuff, there'll be some, I guess you could say, evolutionary advantageous stuff like the toxins. But for the most part, this is still going to be storage for the plant. It's got to put waste somewhere. It's got to go through and put some of its reserves, whether it's food, toxin, water, those need to go somewhere. Now, the next big thing about plants is this idea of plastids. Now, plastids are going to be any organelle that's a lot like the mitochondria in the sense that it's going to typically have DNA, it's going to oftentimes have ribosomes, it's fairly frequent that it has like two sets of membranes, an outer and an inner, or an outer and several inner membrane-bound sections. So these guys appear to have evolved through endosymbiosis. So in other words, these guys used to be their own cells, they appear to have been brought into another cell, and eventually became an organelle. Now there's many different types of plastids, and some of them can actually switch from one form to another, if you will, but we're just going to talk about three. The first two are going to be real quick ones we hit. Chromoplasts, these guys are going to be largely for pigment. And not like photosynthetic pigment, this is more like the petals of a flower, where you'll say, look at that pretty red, look at that pretty yellow. That's what we're going to be dealing with these guys. The leucoplasts typically serve more of a metabolic function, so reactions and such will occur there. So these guys are more specific in terms of what they do. In some cases, you could say they're kind of a cross between what you might get done with some vacuoles, what you might see done with some lysosomes, but they're going to serve largely metabolic or reaction functions within the cell. And then the chloroplast, this is the big one that we'll focus on, and this one's going to be in charge of photosynthesis. Now this seems pretty simple where most people go, oh, photosynthesis. You take sunlight, you take some carbon dioxide in the air, some water, and you make sugar. But I want to make sure you realize photosynthesis is going to make all the organic compounds needed by that plant cell. So the plant cell to grow is going to need lipids, like phospholipids, to build a cell for the membrane. It's going to need to make proteins for enzymes, for the membrane, for everything. It's going to need carbohydrates for the cell wall to line the edges of the cell itself. You have those carbohydrates and the membrane, as well as you need it for food. And then, of course, you'll have to have nucleic acids so that you can make stuff like DNA and RNA. So any nucleic acid, because you need that so that you've got DNA, so that you can actually have the code for life of how to make the plant and how to pass that on. So photosynthesis isn't just about making food. The end result of doing photosynthesis and modifying the end results is that you can get any organic molecule, generally speaking, that the plant needs. And so this is what, when we eat something like a peanut, that's where that fat and that protein came from, is that plant made it by doing photosynthesis and manipulating the end result. It's not just about sugar. And so they're going to be using some of this as food, because plant cells have mitochondria. They do. That's what breaks down the food, if you will. But a lot of this is going to be structural. It lets the plant grow. And some of it will be stored. That's when we eat things, whether it's beets or turnips or carrots or potatoes. That's their energy store that's in the roots. In case some animal comes along and munches on the top part, they can grow back because they have energy reserves. Obviously, if we dig that up and eat it, then they don't, but that's what we're eating if we're having something like a potato. Is that just their backup energy source that they've used? But once again, that's still not like immediate food for them. That's like their long-term food storage. So before we wrap things up, I just want to real briefly go through parts of the chloroplast. And so the chloroplast is going to have two membranes. So we've got the outer membrane and the inner membrane. So this is a lot like when we talked about the mitochondria again, that we've got two levels. The only difference here is there's actually these little membrane-bound sacs even inside of that. So it's almost like there's three layers, if you will, of membranes. And these little membranous sacs are called thylakoids. So if you see me talk about a thylakoid, that's really where photosynthesis occurs. So when we talk about photosynthesis, associate that with these thylakoids. Don't worry so much about the whole granule versus stromal. Don't really care too much about that. But the thylakoids themselves are where photosynthesis will happen. Inside of them and embedded in that actual membrane, the thylakoid membrane versus the actual insides of the thylakoid, like the cytoplasm, if you will. The cytoplasm-like part that's inside this inner membrane that the thylakoids are kind of bathed in, that's called the stroma. And that will be slightly part of photosynthesis. It'll have a role. And so instead of the matrix, we're going to focus on the stroma. And instead of the matrix where it was the innermost part, the stroma's inside, but technically there's still another inside because the thylakoids themselves do have a little bit of stuff that would be in there that's like a cytoplasm. So thylakoid, little disc-like guys, if you see them say the word granum or grana, it's just stacks of thylakoids. So if you line up a bunch of thylakoids together, we just call that a grana. So don't freak out too much about that. Just know thylakoids, the little discs that are inside the double membrane, and then that's pretty much where photosynthesis occurs, including the fluid inside the thylakoid and including the stroma, which is the fluid outside the thylakoid that they're bathed in. At that point, that should be enough for us to get by with the chloroplast, and that should kind of wrap up most of the organelle stuff. We're going to move on next to talking about how cells and multicellular organisms organize themselves. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Bye.